like apply other plugins. Like I'll do, I'm actually, this is the first time I've talked about this. So I'm kind of like thinking in my head of like, oh yeah, I'm doing this now. Right. Cool.
Nice.
But yeah, I take care of any EQ problems right away. And then just like, okay, cool. We have a balance. I can hear everything that's up. There's quite a few things up that are at least kind of making a little bit of harmonic, whatever complexity in the sound that I can then begin to like work on, say, kick and get drums feeling good, and then snare, and then maybe touch on the bass. I do like to kind of, once I do have everything kind of going, I do like to work from drums to bass to then, melodic things. And then of course I may come back to drums and bass as I get going further. Cause again, as you build on a mix, I think no matter what, things will slightly change or need to be adjusted based on things you bring up. But,
absolutely.
Yeah, that's just kind of what I do. And again, no song is different. There's times I've started mixes with vocals. There's times I've started with other things. There's times mixes don't even come in with stuff like that, and you have to do something completely different. So it's all about just being flexible and, having a process, I think, too. Or, excuse me, it's all about being flexible while having a process, but being able to break the process if you need to.
Yeah, like no hard and fast rules.
Right.
So you already mentioned that you have a mix template. Like, is that mostly like a routing situation, or do you have some plugins engaged? What does that look like?
Yeah, a lot of it's routing. I have like bus groups with some plugins on them with maybe a light starting point setting. I would say I have less going on in terms of processing my template these days than I ever used to, partly because with what I'm doing now in terms of building my mix from the very, very start, having less going on just made more sense in terms of processing the sound as I heard it first than having something doing too crazy of a processing thing that doesn't make sense for what's actually there. And I was just like, it wasn't making sense in terms of a workflow. I was running into not problems, but I would think I was making it harder for myself. So I still have like, the whole mix going through like some light mix bus compression and EQ, but when the mix is kind of still young, we'll call it, it's not really at the energy level that my mix bus settings are set to, so it's not really processing a whole bunch there. And as I kind of build in and add my layers and textures, like with parallel compression and things on the drums, I begin to like start getting into where the mix will live volume-wise through the gear, and it kind of just, again, falls into place as you kind of build it. If that makes any sense at all. I don't know. It feels like sometimes I'm sitting...
It makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe you can relate to sometimes like I'm sitting here working on a song and like I'm grinding. It's like the grind mode. Like you're pulling things all up and like making a lot of quick, fast decisions, like trying to like get it to a point. It's like feeling something, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, it's there. You not really sure what happened, but all of a sudden like it just kind of begins to sound like the final, idea of the song. I don't know, it just sometimes happens for me without really knowing what I'm doing. It's like, oh, this just sounds better now. What did I do?
Yeah, because you make so many like fast decisions without even like realizing it. It's just
yes, and
you're in a flow.
There's so many things happening, at least kind of with the textures and layers that you might have going on with parallels and different mix buses going different places. As you begin to mix into those things, they begin to do stuff. They begin to process, and I guess it makes sense that as you build the mix out, obviously, that it would begin to come together. But again, not all mixes do. Some mixes have inherent problems that they're very tricky to put together. Like, gosh. And that's what's so funny. People ask me, like, how long does it take to mix a song? It's like, I don't know. What song is it? Because it always varies.
Totally. There's like 2-hour mixes, 10-hour mixes, maybe days.
Yeah. I've done them all. It feels like...
Wild. Yeah, no, actually what you were saying also in terms of like having that template with those parallel like buses, I guess, set up, maybe that's part of why all of a sudden it's like, oh, it sounds like a mix all of a sudden, because like those like processes are already set up for you.
Yeah, and I start with those down generally, and I should mention that too. When I'm getting that rough balance up, I'm not doing parallel stuff right away. It's just getting the basic sounds there. It's like, okay, kick, snare to the drum buffs, awesome. We can hear it. Cool. Right when I start working on those sounds, they're like, okay, we've got the balance going. I'm now going to tackle kick and snare drum. I may do, again, initial EQ as I need to, quick corrective stuff. But as soon as I feel like I have a relatively good snare sound, I do want to bring up that parallel compressor, because, at least for me, that parallel tends to be a fairly good chunk of the drum sound. And so I do want it up fairly quickly to begin to make decisions off of that in context of the rest of the mix. And of course, then I may go back to the snare and begin to add other processing or tweak the processing that's on there once it's up. But yeah, I love adding those layers. I think that's kind of, where you can kind of have fun with building out a lot of 3D-ness in a mix, is kind of having, a parallel compressor, a parallel distortion channel, doing anything of that nature. It tends to work. And again, you can overdo it too. Again, no rules. There's no rules.
Right. I guess it depends on the song also.
It always does. Yeah, absolutely. Like there's some songs where you don't need to parallel compress the drums, which is weird to me because I generally, with the music that I mix, I'm always doing that. So to not do it on some songs feels very backwards.
Right. But I guess you have to know when to and when not to.
Exactly.
Like the Jedi way or whatever.
Exactly. Mix engineers equals Jedi. I can roll with that.
Yeah, we're gonna roll with that. Do you listen for anything specifically? Let's say like the first time you hear a song, like, and do you like just listen to the rough mix even before you get started listening to throwing up tracks or whatever? Yeah,
I always will listen to the rough mix, usually a couple times over the course of even discussions with the client. Like I will generally, if I don't know the client, I will ask for a rough mix or some music like in discussion, so I just know what they have from the very beginning if I'm able to. And then obviously once the song books or songs book, I'm digesting those rough mixes. I'm learning the songs. I think going to that point, I think learning the song, form wise, and just kind of what's there, what's happening really helps you out as a mix engineer when you get going, other than like pulling up a song you've never heard before, having really no idea what's there, what the form is, or again, where it's going for the first time. Again, it's all about just doing your research. I think that's kind of falls in line with that. If you look at Chris Rodology, he kind of does similar things. He's always working with a rough mix and kind of getting a sense for what the song is. And he might even push some faders up before he's even, and actually I do this too sometimes. I'll be listening to the rough mix and I'll just like push kick, push snare, push bass, vocal, a few keyboards, just kind of like levels where I think they'll be close, then flip over to my Pro Tools output. And obviously it's not amazingly balanced because I just did it without listening. But then right. I never hear at first an instrument in solo when I'm mixing. When I've done the prep, I will solo things out just to know what they are. Like, okay, this is obviously a arpeggiated whatever, cool, next track. But when I'm starting my mix, I really try to focus on never soloing a track too soon until I have a sense of what's going on. I feel like I went on a tangent there. Did I answer your question?
Yes, yeah, totally. So, anything other than the template that you do to keep your workflow a little bit faster and more inspired?
Yeah, I mean, I have all of a variety of effects just made and available to route to. Again, just for ease. Color coding, is all done and taken care of, like in mix prep. I just try to make myself, have as much tools that I think I'm going to need for any given mix, while also not having too many, because I think you can, at least for me, I can overdo it, or I have overdone it in the past. So it's always a careful balance. Surprise, surprise. Of giving yourself exactly what you need to get from point A to point B in the most efficient way that makes sense as possible. And again, I'm doing less than I ever was. Like I have less, turned on that template, at least from the starting point, than I did previously. I've, EQ settings are either flat or like filters at the least, kind of a thing, versus like, oh, I'm just going to, always be boosting a little bit of 4K on my snare drum from the get-go. Like, what if it doesn't need that, And then, then I might be mixing and wondering, like, why is the 4K sound weird in the snare drum? I'm like, oh, because I boosted in my template. You see how that, at least for me, why that wouldn't be helpful.
Yeah, I totally hear that. So, based on the beautiful pictures on your website,
oh, thank you.
Your studio looks amazing. So it's clearly you have like some sort of hybrid setup going on. Like, what are you going out for when you're going in? Do you always go out?
Yeah, I like mixing hybrid. I've been trying to mix hybrid since like I had my first lunchbox, and I bought like microphone preamps just to be able to have microphone preamps. And early on, I was just simply running an insert in Pro Tools out to the transformer input of my Neve 1073s and back into Pro Tools just to have it go through the transformers. And if that did a whole bunch, I'm not really positive, but I did it. And I still do it, actually. That's still part of my mix bus chain, is running my mix through these pair of Neves that I have. In addition to that, now I have also my mix bus compressor, which obviously the whole mix goes through, and that's an SSL style mix bus compressor. Specifically, it's the Germastic Audio Obsidian 500. They make a 19-inch version. This is the 500 series version. I believe they're essentially identical in terms of sound. They might be a hair different. I'm actually not sure. But it's an SSL with a few more features. It's got a great thing to it. I love it. I'm also got the Loop Trotter Monster compressor, which isn't maybe as well known, but I feel like I'm seeing these boxes pop up more and more. They're big, giant, and yellow, if you've seen them in anybody else's racks. And it's a FET compressor, but it also has tube saturation on it. And also it has a blend knob on it for wet and dry. And in mixing, that lives on my music bus, mixed in at about 30% or so with a little bit of that tube saturation and then some compression as well for just the instruments that drums, bass, guitars, keyboards, anything that's not vocals.
So that's so that acts as one of your parallel compression.
It totally does. And it was funny when I was invited to try this particular compressor out from the company, I really honestly had no intention of liking it or really even knowing what I would do with it or what it would sound like. And I was just really impressed with just how big of a sound it had. And because obviously I'm not mixing on a console and there's certain desires to having kind of like a big analog-y feel, I guess. This kind of got close to that. And I found it very useful on the mix bus for just kind of this big enveloping type sound with a little bit of that kind of grit as a texture. You probably can't even, you actually can't hear the distortion that it's adding, but it just feels lifted in a way. I can't.
So why don't you send the vocal to it?
The reason I don't send the vocals to it is because of that kind of dirt thing, and also I don't want the vocal triggering that particular compressor with just the vocal movement.
Yeah,
that's
sure.
We just get it on the mix bus compressor. If I want to color the vocals, I will do it in a different way. On very rare occasions, I have sent some background vocals through the music bus, as I call it in my template, which would hit the monster compressor, and that on occasion does sound kind of cool. It just adds again a very thick, rich texture. At least the times I've tried it to the vocals. Which is nice, but generally lead vocals especially don't hit that. It's just the music comp. The only other hardware that I use during mixing is I have an Inward Connections Brute limiter compressor, which is a 500 series 2-knob compressor, kind of like LA3-ish kind of vibe. It just sounds great. Every mentor or person that I've assisted for or interned for has owned at least one of these, and they're great and not terribly expensive. And it's my first chain compressor on my vocals. So I mix vocals on the channel in a parallel and then on a vocal bus with the combination of the parallel and the channel vocal, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And then so the Brute is the first stage on the channel. I do an 1176, either black or blue on the parallel generally. And again, I will switch this up as needed, but this is generally. And then on the bus, I will oftentimes put an LA2A that just gets a dB just for a little bit of love. And that's how I compress vocals. But it's awesome. It's a great compressor. It sounds awesome on bass too. You can track through it. I will often track things through it when I do that on occasion. Do you print the
the compression back into the software before you, or do you do it all just with your real-time bounce?
Yeah, if I'm using it on a lead vocal, generally it's just inserted and it's just passing audio through continuously. I will sometimes use that compressor on other elements of my mix, say like a bass guitar, and in that case I will print it down because I'll use it on the vocal at that point. And I'll also do that with the Monster too. The Monster's awesome. It has a very wide range of what it can do, especially with that blend. So you can kind of really crank it and then blend it back and just get really unique textures with it. So I'll print overheads through the Monster compressor a lot. I've run pianos through them. I've run different synths, distorted and clean through them, and it just does awesome things. Guitars sound good through it. I've never run drums through them before, but I know people that have used the Monster on their drum bus for good reason, because I'm sure it'd be great. It just, because the way I use it on the music bus, I really can't put it on my drum bus unless I would give it up for the music bus, and I just have more value for it there, I think. But it's supposed to be good there as well. But yeah, and then I would print that stuff down to audio to then put the monster back on the music bus and then continue mixing if I felt that I wanted to process something with it. I don't do it a ton because it does take time, to print it through. But if there's like a sound that's